I do want to talk about the secession of the South. It seems that you two are in agreement as to the reason for it, that being slavery. And we touched on it a little bit earlier about the constitutionality of secession. And um, this is a question I find very interesting. I had a whole podcast episode a couple months back all about Southern secession, and we talked a lot about the constitutionality of it. It seems that the North and South had different interpretations of the Constitution. So why did the South secede, and was it constitutional?
Honestly, I'm afraid I'm going with Kenneth Stamp on this. I think you can make as many arguments for as against. It's not as if it's like all such like legal decisions. It's not legal political decisions. It's not. It's in the end, it will come down to opinion because what you're doing. I mean, Kenneth Stamp. I'll go back to this essay just because I read it recently. It's fresh in my mind. He made the point that one of the arguments is, well, perpetual unions may mention the Articles of Confederation. Stamp just goes, well, hold on, you can't cite the Articles of Confederation because the founders violated them, because in order to replace the Articles of Confederation you had to get unanimity. They just went with 9 out of 13. So according to Stamp, the articles, you cannot cite the Articles of Confederation for for perpetual union. That's just his opinion. I could counter by saying, well, not necessarily. Just because they say rejected one aspect of the articles unworkable doesn't mean they rejected the entire articles. Lincoln at Gettysburg says, no, no, no. The United States of America as a nation dates from the Declaration of Independence. That's the nation's, he didn't say this exactly, but that's the nation's birth certificate. The nation is born in 1776, not 13 independent states. You tell me. This is your I we could have a comment section here and people would pile in and everybody would have different opinions on this. It's very, you can passionately and logically argue for either way. So I this is where I'm sort of like, well, I'm sitting on the fence on this, but understand it was a real issue. People believe they had the right to secede and other people believe they did not. There's not really much doubt about the sincerity on both sides in this war. I don't think I don't think the secessionist cause was made up by John C. Calhoun, for example. I just think he was one of the more able propagandists of it, but the argument was there.
No, I was actually going to make the exact the case that Duncan just tried to raise there with regard to the John C. Calhoun, because I think I agree with Duncan that it depends on who you ask, right? But I think that when it comes down to the Southerners, with going back to Jefferson, Madison, but then really with Calhoun, lay out as flawed as it may be from whichever perspective you come to it, a strong constitutional argument that kind of says that if we look at the Declaration of Independence, we have the right to stand up against oppressive government. The United States was the Constitution of the United States was ratified by the states, not the people, because it was state conventions that did this, and they string together selectively, like every court these days does, a legal argument that when your rights are trampled upon, or you perceive your rights are being trampled upon, you have a right to resist and declare these null and void. If that is then challenged, you can take it another step and secede. So that I would like. I can see a good constitutional argument and a current argument that's based on the history of the United States with regard to the null and void part. Whether to take that then all the way to secession, well, I guess the Declaration of Independence would give you that right.
Right. I think that's the best case, or the best explanation and justification for the South seceding is that the United States was founded by seceding from the British Empire. They gained their independence from the British Empire, and then even Lincoln, he says the nation dates back to the Declaration of Independence. Um, sort of his vision of America is rooted in the Declaration of Independence. This idea that if we disagree with an oppressive, tyrannical regime, we can declare our independence and secede from that. And that's exactly what the South did, honestly. They thought that they were being oppressed by the North. So they declared their independence and seceded from that.
Yeah, it's also interesting as well that, William Lloyd Garrison argued that the northern states should secede from the South to get away from slavery. So it's not as if the Southerners were the only ones who raised or broached secession. Other people did as well. And I'm sure William Lloyd Garrison didn't believe he was advocating anything illegal. Um, this is a well, yeah, maybe. But on the other hand, against Calhoun, you have Webster saying the Constitution is not a compact. It's a rich literature on this, and it's, as I say, in the end, it will come down to opinion, I think.
I I think in part when we think of Lincoln, we always think of him as sort of that like that guy on the monument, right? I'm going to go with the Lincoln Monument in Washington, right? It's a white marble. He's this towering figure. He's usually portrayed as that brilliant legal mind and everything. But when you look at some of the aspects during the Civil War, and there's some doubt, right? Like when you Duncan and I have done a lot of diplomacy, and Lincoln declares a blockade of the southern ports, and Britain is like, you said it's an internal rebellion, but you're blockading your own ports? That doesn't make sense. Legally, it just doesn't make sense. You can't do that. You have to put an embargo on these ports, legally speaking. So Lincoln makes, and I don't want to get into, because we didn't talk about it in the book, but if you read William Marble's book on Fitzjohn Potter's trial after Second Manassas, Lincoln is not very brilliant at all, legally speaking, in that situation. You could make a case with Van Landingham that it's not very brilliant what he is doing.
In Lincoln's defense, he did say he didn't get the opportunity to practice international law in Illinois, which I thought was a good response. Sorry, go on.
Right, but I think this sort of comes down to, right, this um, Lincoln, and there were lots that believed that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were an anti-slavery document too, and that you of course have Southerners, and the way you can read it is it's not an anti-slavery document. So it's I guess that's the beauty and the curse of the U.S. Constitution. You can read it in so many different ways, and the founding of the United States in so many different ways, right? That whole originalist stuff. Like, I don't have Madison handy for me to pull off from the Constitutional Convention minutes, but it's just some notes. We can't even remotely assess what the founders were saying, right? And it's very hard in that regard to kind of.
Yeah, that's true. To sort of linger on what I'm going to call Lincoln's hypocrisy, um, the North and Lincoln viewed the South and their secession as violating the Union, violating the Constitution. But Lincoln himself violated the Constitution, by getting rid of or suspending habeas corpus, overreaching and exercising vast executive power that was, clearly defined in the Constitution. So can you speak to that aspect of Lincoln and the Civil War?
Well, I think in many ways this boils down to what we describe in the chapter on Realpolitik, because Lincoln, like most politicians during this period, be that like Juarez in Mexico, be that um, Napoleon, Bismarck, Cavour, Gorshakov in Russia, they are first and foremost thinking about the aggrandizement and security and best interest of their state. And when you're faced with a major crisis that threatens the very existence of your nation, of your state, you're willing to forego temporarily some of the constitutional limitations that are placed upon you, right? Like Bismarck basically says, all right, you don't want to cooperate with me, Landtag? Then I will ignore you and just use the monies that I can collect anyways to increase the military power. And you will cheer me when I bring about German unification. Right? And you can see that very much in the, I'm going to forget the second case, but in the Supreme Court. They will agree with what Lincoln did in Van Landingham because they understood that in this moment of political crisis, Lincoln will ignore them if they disagree with him. But once the crisis of war is over and certain level of saneness has returned, they very much will be like, no, you were wrong in this type of situation. And I think yes, we can definitely think of this as Lincoln being hypocritical and ignoring the constitutional limitations. But I think in the larger scheme, what we also want to consider is that the United States eventually did return to that constitutionality, right? That we didn't drift like, let's say, Mexico, right? Juarez then has to use emergency powers. Eventually, they will return to the Constitution, but then within 10 years, it gets a Porfirio Rato with Porfirio Diaz. So, long term, the state collapsed into a dictatorship. That didn't happen in the United States. So, it is, as much as I hate making an exceptionalist argument, there is sort of something where the United States didn't have that drift.
Well, there is one thing that does mark the US out as well, I would note, is, and this ties back to our earlier point about secession, they don't actually try Jefferson Davis and the others. There are no treason trials. I know they hang some guys for war crimes, but that's different. That's murder and whatever. They don't actually try to put a legal case against these guys. They imprison them, they do all the rest of it, but they never actually go to court on this. And I've always found that very interesting. And I think part of it's common sense. They don't want to create martyrs. So that's okay. But it's interesting for all the legal talk and all the rest of it about the lost constitution. They don't actually take this to court. Jefferson Davis is just released, as are the other Confederate commanders, and that's it. Uh, kind of that's the end of the story. The late unpleasantness is over, and that is it. That too, I've always found very interesting.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of you. In times of war, especially when the Union is in jeopardy, um, sometimes you have to take sort of extraordinary measures. And also, at the time of secession, Congress, I don't think, was in session. So Lincoln didn't really have anywhere to go. He was like, if I need to do something about this and I need to do it now, I'm going to have to take these measures. But I think, Duncan, you make a great point. Following the Civil War, of not trying Jefferson, not having any trials of treason, not only because they don't want to make martyrs, but also I think because they don't want to set a precedent. It's sort of like when George Washington stepped down after his second term. You don't want to set a precedent of ruling for life. You want to set the precedent of peace and forgiveness forward following the Civil War.